Media recognition from Bloomberg, Reuters, recycling trade publications. Patented process for 100% recovery of critical metals, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, manganese, aluminum. American Manganese is focused on recycling lithium-ion batteries for electric vehicles. American Manganese trades on the TSX Venture, AMY, the US, AMYZF, and Frankfurt 2AM. For more information, visit AmericanManganeseInc.com or phone me, Larry Ray, at 778-574-4444.
You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is Stewart Muir, Executive Director of the ResourceWorks Society. His website, resourceworks.com. His Twitter handle, at SJMuir. Welcome back to the show, Stewart.
Thank you, Jim.
In Europe, energy companies are going down like tin ducks at the exhibition shooting gallery. What's the story there, this European energy crisis? All started with the wind farms being becalmed a few weeks ago, I think.
Yeah, and for anyone who goes back to the early 1970s, who was around then when we had gas stations in North America running out of gas, it basically looks like that right now across Britain, where they don't have truck drivers to get fuel to petrol stations. People are stockpiling. There are all sorts of problems. At the same time, they have a collapse in wind power because just a bizarre quirk of Mother Nature. There's been low wind in Europe. In recent decades, Europe has greatly expanded its reliance on wind. It's huge, and Britain's one of those countries. Suddenly, they don't have that supply. What happens? Well, they have had to go to coal backup. They've been using natural gas. The cost of all this has been going up. At the same time, we've got oil prices going up globally, over $80 a barrel now, and natural gas prices are yoked to that. And we've seen gas prices like 2014 before the big crash in those days. All of these factors are coming to play in Europe. At the same time, in Britain, we're about a month away from the COP21 being hosted in Glasgow, where it's all about climate change and international governments coming together for work on this. It's kind of ironic that here we have Europe that is so adept at congratulating itself for their doubling down on their pledges to slash CO2 emissions. They love criticizing Canada and other countries and pointing to their own record. Well, it turns out that their approach has very much contributed to a European-wide energy crisis right now that is unprecedented in recent times, if not ever. They've been shutting down coal plants for decades, which I think anyone would agree that's a good direction to be going in. But when we see the combination of factors here really walloping their economies, they've got to be thinking about what is going to be a better way to go about this? I think the economies there cannot withstand these prices for energy if they're to continue functioning. It's a time, and I wrote recently in Business in Vancouver when this crisis started that the opportunity that Canada has to be a positive player. We want to be part of global decarbonization. We want to use the things that we have in Canada, our Canadian know-how, to be part of that. And one of the things we have in spades is the ability to get natural gas to other markets. Right now, Europe is relying on Russia for a lot of natural gas. They have a new pipeline. Russia is coming into a very primary role of energy supply there, which means it has power over Europe. And who wants Vladimir Putin to be deciding things for you? But that's what they're walking into. The fact that there's an alternative like Canada to supply LNG, we're ready, we're willing. We have internal barriers, like the province of Quebec has said, no, we don't want this. I mean, they love consuming natural gas. Last time I was in Montreal in the dead of winter, I walked around downtown there looking at all the buildings that have natural gas. I mean, they completely rely on it, but they love nothing better than to point a finger as if they're in some sort of moral high position on this when they're not. I mean, it's a Quebec quirk, but more meaningfully for Western Canada, they've actively prevented Western gas from getting to the Atlantic coast so it can be turned into LNG and sent to Europe. That's an opportunity that's been restricted for Canada. If we're to get LNG there, we'll probably have to do it through parts of the country that are more aligned to the Canadian mission and caring about Canadian priorities.
Could we use railways or the St. Lawrence Seaway to get Western LNG to Europe?
Well, that's a creative idea. I think we're seeing containerization of LNG going to China, for example. There's a BC project that's been testing that out for a while now into 40-foot flasks, basically, that they zip over as quickly as possible. You know, it's a 10-day journey to the docks in China, basically. And then that LNG is sent right to exactly the place where it's needed, be it manufacturing or local electricity production in China. It works. The technology exists. So yeah, we could do that for sure, sending it that way. I think it's a matter of time. You don't want your LNG to be in shipment for too long because it has.
Well, we could get it. I believe with the pipelines, we could get it to Sarnia, and from there, perhaps ship it. But how long does it take that ship? Well, the Atlantic's smaller than the Pacific, so it should get there faster.
The rest of the way, and then get it onto a ship. You know, you could probably make that work. I think that is an option.
If we knew this was going to happen long term, because it takes a long time to organize that and to build those.
That's kind of a secondary option. The best option is that you create a manufacturing plant for LNG right on the coast, and then you get it directly onto a ship to its destination. That's the most efficient way. That creates the highest efficiency. It ensures there's the least loss of gas, and I think if it gets to the point where the prices sustain more costly solutions, well, sure, we could have more of a micro LNG plant feature. On the West Coast, what we're seeing with LNG Canada being built in Kitimat, that project is well underway, probably about 4 years out from being completed, sending the first ship to its customers in Asia. Then we also have I think the strong likelihood that the wood fiber LNG plant near Squamish is going to continue. They've done a lot of work in site cleanup at the wood fiber site and investing in all of the regulatory permits, which is a huge, expensive kind of out of sight. It's not the part of a project that you see, but it's absolutely essential for anything that ever gets built. So they've been working on that for quite a few years, and it's ready to go. So hopefully it does move ahead in this setting where they've got the prices.
Now, of course, we have, again, the eco movement about 2 years ago decided that natural gas was as evil as thick, sludgy crude. But to the observer, everywhere they've gone from burning coal or other fuels like that and switched to natural gas, the skies are clear. We don't have smog from it. And also, doesn't Canada have the latest in carbon capture to look after any extra pollution that might be caused by LNG?
Yeah, investments are being made, particularly in Alberta, where so much of the oil and gas is extracted and the early processing. So you've got major multi-billion-dollar commitments happening right now this year that have been signed towards hydrogen, towards carbon capture, all of this cleaning up of oil and gas. The idea that there is a kind of magic switch, all we have to do is wish, and there will be an energy transition because we wish it to be that way. That's kind of what they've been pursuing in Europe, because there's been a vigorous industry and lobbying activities to persuade decision makers to just accept this. And it turns out not to be true. You do have problems with unreliables. In the first instance, they're not reliable. We don't have the means right now to store the energy that's produced when the wind's blowing really hard, say, and use it later. We just don't have that. So it's very much what the current supply is to serve demand. And I think the idea of this 100% renewable thing, it's become a mantra. There's been a massive investment by investors behind renewables to try to get out there and seed the public relations messages about the miracle of renewables. And if we, again, just wish that it change, it will change. It really doesn't work that way. The laws of physics are rather rigorous when it comes to this. The amount of energy that humans use today is increasing. We haven't developed all the ways that we need in order to derive that energy without creating the impacts that we've seen from traditional approaches to energy, which are clearly a problem. I think we're long past the time when we need to waste a lot of time debating whether there's a problem or not. Obviously, there's a problem. But if you're earnest and genuine in wanting to solve the problem, you don't need to accept that, someone saying you just need to wish for there to be 100% renewables that will solve our problems. We shouldn't feel ashamed if someone is waving their finger in our face with that claim when it's a false claim. What we need to do is invest in the science, in the innovation, whether it's the natural processes that we can accelerate, whether it's new technologies that we can use to capture carbon, to mitigate it, to find alternative energy that actually works and is reliable. Because we don't want Canada to become a scene like Europe is right now. I mean, that would be a disastrous outcome for the way of life that we have. And that's really ultimately what it comes down to.
Now, we have people in Toronto and Vancouver, cities with moderate climates. Vancouver hardly has winter at all, and yet Canada as a nation is the second coldest country on the planet. Don't we have to take into consideration you want a reliable energy source, especially in the colder months? And now that we're getting these major heat waves in the summer, the deadliest weather event in Canadian history was the heat wave that hit southern BC at the end of June. It killed between 500 and 800 people. So don't you need reliable energy sources for not just heating but cooling? Natural gas would serve that, because I believe BC's got a 200-year proven reserve of natural gas.
Yeah, I think the challenge we should be accepting is how do we use things that work today, that are reliable, that we have access to, that are affordable. If they have imperfections in them, which obviously every energy form does, let's identify those and mitigate them. Right now, we have a truly massive investment in the ground in terms of infrastructure to distribute natural gas to where it's used. We have the appliances in our homes. In the UK, they've been seeing a lot of interest in weatherizing their homes or insulating them, their ancient homes. I mean, you go to some Tudor village with, the wattle and daub and old construction like that in places, which is not all of Britain, but there's plenty of that kind of stuff. How do you insulate that to modern standards? I don't know how you even do that. But you can take out the gas boiler and put in maybe a heat pump. And I know there's a big move towards that in the UK. So that would then put more of the pressure on the electricity system of the country, the grid, to make sure it's supplying the kind of energy they want. Now, if because wind has been, over relied upon in their planning and isn't there when it's needed, you suddenly are firing up your old coal plants, which were not mothballed but idled. Is going to a heat pump in your home going to reduce the carbon emissions of your country? I don't know. Maybe it would still be a net gain if you do that. I think that's information people need to have and want to have.
Yeah, and largely unexplored.
Same in Canada.
Yeah, and largely unexplored in British Columbia is geothermal, considering we have either a volcano or an extinct volcano every 25 miles along the coastal mountains. Yeah, there's got to be some heat down there somewhere.
Yeah, the problem is it's a little hard to get the technology in place there. When I started my career as a journalist in my early 20s, I remember writing about the Meager Creek Hot Springs near Pemberton, and there was an engineer, former BC Hydro guy, who had gone out and he had this dream. This was like 40 years ago, Jim. He was going to create geothermal at Meager Creek. All the resource was there. It made sense. There was a demand for the power. There was a transmission line nearby there. Perfect. Well, nothing's happened in that whole time, despite people like that wanting to see it accelerate. In the early part, the Gordon Campbell government in BC, when they came in 2001, in a couple of years after that, Campbell, who was a real energy visionary, he had a lot of ideas on clean energy. He came up with this big plan. They were going to develop geothermal. They had plans for wind off northern Vancouver Island and other parts of the province. Some of that has come about. There's actually wind farms. I know a few people get a chance to drive around Tumbler Ridge and up towards Dawson and Fort St. John, but you go up there and yeah, we got wind in BC. It's pretty cool, but there's not a lot of it. And things like geothermal, it's only now, this year, that we've seen a commercial geothermal plant start to be developed, and that's because of the Fort Nelson First Nation. They've been very quickly accelerating their project. They have wells there, former gas wells, that have got hot water down the bottom, and they've now got a program to harness it. So geothermal is coming. It is pretty cool. There is a resource out there, but as history has shown us, it takes a very long time, and it's hard to scale. It's very costly. Let's hope we get it done, though. As far as other things, BC, we have so many options in fuel types, and we're also a place where you tend to have these kind of environmental movements that are more about hearts and minds and emotion than they are about the hard facts of things. So when someone just says, we need to get 100% renewable for Vancouver, as if that's something you could do. I mean, think about it. You can you can run your hospitals, your swimming pools, your restaurants, your ambulances, your fire trucks without oil and gas, really? I don't know how you do that, because all of these necessary functions in society rely just as much as the average person does on having reliable energy around. We just don't have the means. And that's why I think if we really care about the issue, you're looking at a whole range of options. You're ruling nothing out. We're exploring everything. And those who are just looking at this one narrow thing, get off fossil fuels, it's kind of dumb, because it automatically rules out a whole bunch of options that are ones we need to look at. With chemical energy, it's certain, it's reliable, it's abundant. And from the science perspective, you're asking the question, well, how do I engineer this so that we're taking out the things we don't want as products of using chemical energy, which is, fossil fuels, petroleum, that's a chemical energy. How do we engineer out the negative effects and keep the positive impacts? To me, that's a very simple, clear scientific question. It's one we need to ask. But instead, we have people saying, okay, how do we get these unicorns and rainbows creating energy for us? Well, it's not working in Europe. Why would it be any different? How is it going to work in Canada? It won't.
China has an energy crisis as well, and this one has to do with a coal shortage, and I would imagine it's also behind their decision to ban cryptocurrencies because they need so much energy to be mined.
Yeah, well, China has made some headlines recently because we're going to stop building new coal plants in foreign countries, because as part of their, whether it's a Belt and Road initiative to create transportation infrastructure around the globe, basically from China to Europe for the most part, or whether it's part of their foreign policy, their economic foreign policy, which is to invest in countries in deep infrastructure that make the countries very reliant on China for their foreign relations and their trade relations. China's strategy has been to create things like that. So, they're in there drilling for oil in Africa. They are drilling for oil in Cuba. I've seen them doing that when I was down there recently. They're all over the world creating energy solutions. Coal's been part of that. They're now saying we won't build any more foreign coal plants, but they're still building them at home. Something like 250 gigawatts of new coal facilities are being built right now. And to get an idea of how big that is, take Site C, which is 5 gigawatts, and divide that into 250, and what do you get? You get like 50 Site Cs would be the equivalent of the coal capacity being built just right now this year in China. They're investing immensely. Now, the problem is that coal is up there. It's as high as $200 a ton for thermal coal. So Australia is getting quite rich from this, and Russia and other coal-producing countries. But it's a real problem for the consumers, because that's a very, very high price that they have to pay. And so China's concerned. At the same time, China needs to keep the lights on in China. That's a primary goal, and it can only do that right now with coal. It's seen quite a very significant expansion in their solar and wind, but it's still quite a small fraction of their overall electricity production. And they've also increased the reliance on natural gas. And, they're certainly a country, China, I mean, despite the diplomatic issues, the ongoing, extremely aggressive tactics, that the two Michaels in Canada experienced, that's unacceptable. But at the same time, Canada is an intense trade partner with China on a number of fronts, and that's one of the difficulties for any governing group in Ottawa in managing this situation. And right now, LNG from Canada, whether it's China, but also Taiwan, Korea, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, these are some of the countries that want natural gas. I noticed today that Sri Lanka, a country I love and have been able to travel around. I've met the president and been entertained at his home there in Colombo, seen the cultural splendor of the country, and traveled around to the tea plantations a few years ago as part of a Commonwealth group I was involved in. It's a wonderful place. There's lots of Sri Lankans in this country. They've just announced today that they will be building an LNG import terminal near the capital of Colombo on the coast, and they need that, because if they don't have that, they'll just be burning more coal, and that's something that seems to be lost on, the anti-fracking, the anti-natural gas campaigners in Canada. You get these different groups out there. I guess someone's ginning them up to do this, but it's kind of irrational to me that you should work so hard to prevent global access to a cleaner commodity. I mean, we know it's cleaner. Why are you trying to stop it? It's irresponsible. So I would love to see the day when Sri Lanka is not creating the amount of pollution that it is because of its coal. But it can only do that if it has LNG.
We've had a court ruling in British Columbia concerning a forestry, an old-growth forest protest on Vancouver Island. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, there's been logging in an area. It's called, to the forest technical people, it's called TFL, or Tree Farm License, 46, popularly known now as Fairy Creek, which is a small watershed that's part of a very large, sprawling TFL 46. And so for the last year, more than a year, there's been an embedded protester group in there that is part of a coalition of environmental groups that are seeking to affect government policy in British Columbia on forestry. So this is kind of the street version of that campaign. There's lobbyists, there's people who are getting into the policy discussions in government and pushing their agenda that way. And then there's also people who are part of that agenda, and they're pushing it in Fairy Creek by staging spectacular, media-friendly protest events that get them in the headlines and create a sort of culture of grievance because of the excessive nature of the protests. They're damaging equipment, they're placing workers in danger, they're abusing the local First Nation, which is asked, I think, at least 5 times that the protesters leave the area. So, I mean, when you see these headlines, here's the number one important thing to understand is that you're the audience for those protests. They want you to form a sentiment around it so that policymakers in Victoria can feel affected by your sentiment around it, and that's what's going on. It's a modern age, tactic that we've seen used in different parts of the world to put pressure on governments, and the argument is certainly that it's about certain facts to do with forest policy, and there are facts involved in it. But I think the important fact here is that we have a huge amount of forest in British Columbia. Vancouver Island and the coast are quite distinct from the rest of the province just because of the physical characteristics of the forests. The trees grow bigger. It's a 250-year threshold before you determine a tree to be old growth, and there is a vast amount of old growth forests on the island. There's some areas that have been hit harder, and I think there's legitimate concerns over ecosystems and management, but there's also a range of views on what to do about it. And once again, it's not dissimilar from the whole energy thing, Jim. You've got people who are pushing a certain agenda. They're going to do that no matter what. It might not be the right agenda. It might not be based in science, but you're going to be hearing about it. And as with so many natural resource issues, I find myself analyzing a lot of them. This one has many of the hallmarks that we've seen in other areas where it's a kind of a very small portion of our community that wants a certain outcome, that tries to seize the megaphone and be heard above everyone else and drown out other interests. We've seen the workers groups come forward. The trade unions are complaining rather bitterly about the dangers being created for their members working in the woods. You've got people up to really dumb antics to distract fallers. The the occupation of tree falling, is one of the most dangerous ones in the country, and that's why the training for it is extreme. That's why their procedures for safety are extreme. So when they're out there in a cut block and they're falling trees, they're following all of these rules. Suddenly you have people running in, as is happening now, to disrupt it. It's creating danger for the protesters, danger for the workers, danger for the police force. It's a terrible situation. So what's happened as we speak today, we have a ruling from a judge that says an injunction that covers the area of Fairy Creek has expired and it's not going to be renewed, which creates an interesting problem. It's certainly true that there's criminal activity, that the judge said as much, that has to be enforced by police, but it will be done a different way. And it's early days. I think the media story, it's kind of been protesters are celebrating their victory in court. Well, is it really a victory if what the judge is saying is that, the things you're doing, no matter how well-intentioned you may feel you are still illegal? If you're vandalizing equipment, if you're creating physical conflicts and you're assaulting people and so forth, you still are subject to the law. The laws of Canada do apply in Fairy Creek still. That hasn't changed.
Yeah, now I saw in the ruling as well, the judge wasn't going to extend the injunction because he cited heavy-handed treatment of the protesters by the RCMP and the RCMP's unwarranted exclusion of the media from the area to cover what was going on. So it looks like the RCMP perhaps were hoisted on their own petard.
Well, I think the RCMP clearly have some things to reformat in how they approach this. I'll tell you, I do watch the Fairy Creek, the media coverage. The journalists or quote unquote journalists who have been excluded, if you ask the question, well, what sort of journalists are we talking about? These are the ones who've been excluded for the most part are ones who wouldn't be recognized by the journalism profession as journalists. These are people who just pick up a camera and say, I'm a journalist. Maybe they have a blog or some fringe media, but it's not like major media outlets. I think there's been maybe one exception where someone from a more mainstream media outlet was able to say, hey, I couldn't get in here. But for the most part, that access is there. Sometimes it's more difficult. People think it's just like going to the mall or going to the park in the city. You go to Fairy Creek, so you can just go anywhere. It's complicated. These are industrial roads. Their use is governed by a special set of legislation applying to rural roads. And there's questions of safety. There's good reason that you're told to have a two-way radio in your vehicle if you're driving on industrial roads in rural BC. There's a staggering amount of roads. It's someone told me the figure. It's like 1 million kilometers of roads in BC.
Yeah, all subject to things like landslides and the road suddenly being swept away from underneath you. And
So you've got someone, from some undergrad from UVic says, hey, let's go spend the weekend at Fairy Creek. So they jump in their 1992 tan Corolla and they drive up there with their friends and guess what? They don't have a radio. They don't have a shovel. They don't have GPS. They really don't have any survival skills, and they're just putting themselves out there into an industrial setting. It's almost like you're walking into a factory with moving parts and things are going on around you, and you have no protective gear and no one knows you're there. They're placing themselves in harm's way, and it's quite dangerous. I hope WorkSafe gets involved here because we've seen some incidents recently endangering working people that are quite disturbing. It's not right that people who just are trying to put food on the table for the family are going to work and they're facing things like tree spiking, where malicious individuals are trying to actually kill you using their methods. It's not right, and I'm actually quite disappointed that we have a judge who is blind to the safety of workers. It's a travesty of justice, really.
Yeah, tree spiking, spike caught by a chainsaw comes out at the velocity of a rifle bullet and can go right through your head, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's not just in the woods with chainsaws, by the way, Jim. A log that goes into a manufacturing plant, and right now the BC forest economy, it's being told, it's all about manufacturing. Got to add value, and that's manufacturing. Well, you put a log into a manufacturing plant, into a sawmill, where it's going to be turned into something else, and it goes through a saw. Guess what? That saw blade explodes. Someone's in a booth there, flying parts. I mean, this is a real danger. And these protesters who they love to light up the patchouli and strum the guitar about their wish to save the earth. There's actually some of them. I'm not saying this is all of them, certainly. I think a lot of them are truly well-intentioned and nice people and everything. But there are some very nasty people, criminals who are operating there with no regard for human life or respect for our laws.
We'll have more with Stewart Muir right after this.
Don't miss out. Stay informed. Receive the HowStreet.com weekly recap with thought-provoking podcasts, radio, and articles delivered to your inbox. Sign up for the HowStreet.com weekly recap on our homepage at HowStreet.com.
Welcome back. We're speaking with Stewart Muir. Stewart, next May you have an event coming up. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, well, one of the great changes, the positive changes in Canadian society in the recent couple of years has been the arrival of enhanced legislation for the benefit of Indigenous Canadians. And that comes in the form of the UNDRIP, or United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People law. September 30th is now the Truth and Reconciliation Federal Day. Lots of people will be marking that tomorrow. They'll be wearing their orange shirts. They'll be thinking about what is needed to achieve reconciliation. I think more than ever, many years of decades of my life of following these issues, I think now, just in this past these past few years, we've seen more and more people say, well, what can I do in this? And when we asked that question a couple of years ago at ResourceWorks, which is the group that I am executive director of, you can read about us at resourceworks.com, we saw that in 2016, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out with a whole bunch of recommendations. One of them was that corporate Canada step into this and become part of reconciliation through things that corporate Canada can do. And so that's when we had the idea, well, why don't we help connect corporate Canada with Indigenous Canada and find out what's going on. What we discovered was a big thing that's happening is partnerships. First Nations companies or First Nations governments and the companies they have are making investments. They're partnering with companies, be it, crown corporations, it could be private companies or publicly traded companies, to do all kinds of things, whether it's building infrastructure projects, whether it's operating businesses, whether it's in cities or in rural areas. That's the big story. And as we looked around further, we realized there was really no one talking about that. So we decided, 2 years ago to start an event, and it took off. The first year we had 600 people. Last year, despite COVID, we had, I think, almost 400 people online, which is a little harder to do than physical events, we found out. And the event is called the Indigenous Partnerships Success Showcase. And all we're really doing is bringing those who have successfully partnered with Indigenous Canada and corporate Canada to do interesting, necessary things that elevate all of the performance of Canada in regards to achieving reconciliation. And so there's many things that need to happen for that to happen, for reconciliation to happen, but this is a necessary part. And I'm quite proud to say that we have, as of today, released our dates. May 26th and May 27th, 2022 is our next event. It will be in Vancouver. We hope it will be live, but the uncertainty. And if anyone wants to know more about it, indigenoussuccess.ca is the website, and ResourceWorks as well has got some information on it. So, Jim, that's what we're doing. Really excited about it, and it's going to be a big deal.
Now, with the logging protests in Fairy Creek on Vancouver Island, protests in Vancouver against natural gas pipelines, the actual Indigenous people in those territories have already approved these projects, have they not? Well,
in the case, yeah. It's not 100%. What's 100%? Unless you're, running the elections in North Korea, when do you ever get 100% of people saying the same thing on any issue? Well, never. Things are no different. There's always a mixture. And this idea that, it has to be 100% this or that way is a myth. But specifically, I think the First Nation in Fairy Creek have issued at least 5 statements calling on these protesters who are not from their nation, with a couple of exceptions, to withdraw. Those groups won't do that. I mean, why would they? They're making probably $10,000, $15,000 a day on GoFundMe's from people who see that and have an emotional connection to the protests and give them money. So I don't think they would ever want to give up this cash cow. Probably got these protesters around forever at this point. And yet it's in spite of the wishes of the First Nation that is really just trying to be able to live as other Canadians do, and has been prevented from that for a whole bunch of reasons, including not having access to good jobs and sources of revenue. Their support of forestry, which they believe is responsible and sustainable in their area, has been impeded by these unwanted protesters who refuse to leave, because they're making so much money off GoFundMe's. With LNG, you've got in the case, say, of Canada LNG, the First Nation on the coast where the LNG plant is being built, that's the Haisla First Nation in Kitimat. They've been at the very center of that project right from the very beginning and are totally supportive of it. The Wet'suwet'en First Nation, I traveled through that country early last year during the national rail crisis. I wanted to find out what was really going on. I discovered that the truth of the matter was most of the Wet'suwet'en members that I met were actually supportive of having storage revenues so they can preserve their language through teaching and education, so they can respect their elders by creating health, transportation, and safety, things like that for their members. I mean, that's what they see in LNG and infrastructure investment. They see opportunity. And so this idea that First Nations are against development, I think it's a very small fraction who are in that sort of radical wing. It's maybe if you look at the Assembly of First Nations, there's certainly that voice there, but the vast majority of First Nations leadership, in my experience, in Canada today, are looking for ways to advance their cultural agenda, to get through and past the effects of colonialism, which have been, in many cases, very debilitating for so many people in so many communities. And one way to do that, one necessary part of that, is to have economic resources, because then you can start making decisions and doing things.
Stewart, thank you so much for chatting with us.
Thanks, Jim.
My guest has been Stewart Muir, Executive Director of the ResourceWorks Society. His website, resourceworks.com. Find him on Twitter at SJMuir. If you have any questions for Stewart or any of our other guests, you can send them to info@howstreet.com. Our YouTube channel is Talk Digital Network. Find us on Twitter at House Street. We're also on Facebook. I'm Jim Goddard. Thank you for listening.
Comments made on HowStreet.com radio are an expression of opinion only and should not be construed in any matter whatsoever as recommendations to buy or sell any financial instrument at any time. Available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. HowStreet.com radio is a production of House Street Media Incorporated.